Richard Red Lawhern, thank you for joining me. Tell us and your viewers a little bit about, and our viewers a little bit about your background in being a patient advocate for pain management.
Well, about 25 years ago, my wife came down with something that we initially thought was a tooth root abscess problem. And it turned out to be something very different. And it took us 6 doctors in a year to find out what different it was. It was a variety of face pain that is a form of neuropathy, basically generated by nerve damage. And it is one of the most painful conditions that we know in medical practice. While we were sorting out with the doctors what she actually was dealing with and what to do about it, we went to a meeting of the U.S. National Trigeminal Neuralgia Association, now rebranded as the Face Pain Association. And I talked with the founder of that group, a lady by the name of Claire Patterson, and asked a question, and that was, what are you doing to raise your visibility with the developing communities in the internet? Now, this was 1996, roughly. And she crooked a finger at me and she said, I want to talk to you after the meeting. And a year later, I found myself on the board of directors of the TN Association and signed on as their webmaster and principal research writer. And from there, I got really very active in social media and in what was then called the US ENet or Users Net, which is a predecessor to a lot of the bulletin boards and chat rooms that we see now. And I started translating medical literature for people who couldn't understand it and helping them to understand where the authoritative sources were for information that they could use in working with their doctors to find relief from agonizing pain. Now, starting about 2010, I started getting reports from the relatively few people who treat face pain with a doctor's help using opioid medications. And what they were telling me was, my doctor is getting really uncomfortable because he's seeing these actions by various federal and state authorities that seem to be oriented toward denying opioid treatment to people who need it. And what's this all about? So I started getting involved in the research of that. And rapidly I found that even beginning as early as 2010, there were quite a number of initiatives being floated by anti-opioid advocates in an effort to deny opioids to anybody, literally, and everybody. And it went so far as to involve petitions by a group called Physicians for the Responsible Opioid Prescribing, PROP, to the FDA in an effort to put a black box warning on all opioids, discouraging their use and basically saying you shouldn't use these more than a few days if you have to use them at all. And FDA kicked them out of court. Basically, the FDA group that's charged with reviewing these matters told PROP, you guys don't know what you're talking about. And PROP then started lobbying other organizations, and it turns out there was a long-standing relationship between key figures in that organization and the CDC. So they went to CDC and said, we have an opioid epidemic. You really ought to do something to regulate this more. And starting about 2014, CDC started to gather its ammunition, if you will, for a very restrictive guideline that was later issued in 2016, and which almost didn't get any public notice or public commentary because CDC tried to limit review to 3 days. Public review to 3 days. And it turned out that an outfit called the Washington Legal Foundation went to congressional committee, specifically the Government Oversight and Reform Committee, and said, hey, this isn't right. This is a major guideline that's going to be issued against medical practice in a very large field, and it's had no public review. And the oversight committee came back to CDC and said, guys, open this up for public review. And I saw some of the public review, and in fact, I commented even in that stage, which was late 2015. And I can tell you from reading the details that CDC deliberately and with knowledge of what they were doing ignored every bit of input they got. They made no significant changes to a guideline that was flat out wrong and that they knew was wrong. And this is one of those nasty little government scandals that most of the time we don't hear about because it's been buried in the paperwork long ago, now basically 8 years ago. So I got involved in trying to find out what the truth of opioid practice was. And I found out that basically they work pretty well. And for most people, most of the time, they're very safe. But CDC is saying, if you're exposed to these more than a few days, you'll be an addict. To which my answer or my comment is horse feathers. We knew that even in 2016. And we know it even more now because there's a great deal more research that's been developed since. I'm one of those that has been working in that research. I have a number of papers published in the field. And in this case, the number of papers is about 130. All of them since 1912, or since 2012, sorry. So that's how I got into this. People basically said, hey, help me understand what's going on here. And because I'm a research type and have been doing this for years, I started finding out what's going on. And it just appalled me. It has ever since we got started into this mess.
So if I'm just, watching TV, casually maybe reading a newspaper or getting some things online, which most people do these days, I might think that from what I've seen, the opioids are terrible. They're bad. They're evil. They're, the worst thing since the last worst thing. There's lawsuits, big pharma is to blame. But one, have I been misled? Has the public been misled there? And two, is there blame? Or is it I don't want to say a group effort, but, patients, doctors, pharmaceuticals, government have all had a hand in this.
Okay, complicated question, so we'll spend a little time on it.
Sure.
First of all, I think you need to be aware that the news we're hearing about the settlement that occurred with Purdue Pharma, that settlement was never on merits. That settlement is completely bogus on science because Purdue Pharma and others who were urging more prescribing of opioids were very well aware in the 2000 to 2010 period that pain is the most undertreated condition in medical practice, but it's also the most current or common problem that brings somebody to a doctor. So pain as the fifth vital sign, even though it was a kind of advertising meme and it was broadly used by the pharmaceutical companies, pain as the fifth vital sign is accurate. It's true. And the lawsuits that were filed against Big Pharma are again based on the assertions of anti-opioid witnesses. And I might add, many of those witnesses have made a ton of money out of from U.S. government reimbursement for their time. They're basically financially self-interested in persecuting and prosecuting Big Pharma. And state attorney generals are financially interested in the same thing because they're running out of the money that the big tobacco settlement generated, and they're looking for a new cash cow. State attorney generals don't care that they're harming patients. They don't care that they're lying through their teeth about the role that Big Pharma has played. They just want to get the big boys. And the settlement, it's a multi-billion-dollar settlement from Purdue, is one part of that. As I said, it's as bogus as a $3 bill on merit. Likewise, they have succeeded in driving Johnson & Johnson out of the opioid market. They're going to stop making all opioids. And we're going to see in the near future, if somebody doesn't say stop this idiocy, we're going to see the denial of pain care to literally 40 million patients. And it's going to be blanket. So I've been working to understand what's been going on in this field from both the standpoint of public policy and the standpoint of science. And I can tell you that when you hear something on television or radio or something that starts out talking about the opioid epidemic, as soon as that phrase comes up, you've got a clue that what you're facing is not news, it's propaganda. And it's anti-opioid propaganda that has no basis in science whatever. We know that now beyond any reasonable doubt. I can give you examples if we get a little deeper into our talk. So basically, the answer to your question is Big Pharma indeed did some things that were sharp business practice when they started prescribing in the 2000 to 2010 period. But we now know from very good statistical analysis that the driving factor on opioid overdose deaths and dependency was, in that period, mostly pill mills, mostly the few medical doctors who were basically operating outside of the guidelines of reasonable medical practice and handing out pills with no kind of real monitoring of outcomes and no real patient evaluation or assessment up front. Well, that particular influence went away, even though it only in a small way contributed to the increases in opioid deaths over that period. That influence went away when the DEA finally got the message and started going after pill mills. And that was about 2010 to 2011. After that time, there's a very interesting statistic that I share with people, and this is something you can absolutely verify from published data. This is not an opinion, this is fact. Opioids are prescribed most often to seniors, age 62 and up, because seniors have more medical conditions that create pain. These conditions are progressive, they get worse over time. They develop as an outgrowth of a wide variety of conditions that are individually painful, acutely painful, and the acute pain often turns into chronic pain. And guess why? It's because it's undertreated in many cases. So seniors who get the most opioid prescribing have the lowest rates of opioid overdose related deaths by a factor of 3 to 1. Kids under the age of 19 have the lowest prescription rates for opioids, and they have a rate of opioid related overdose death that is 3 times that of seniors. So what I've been telling people for the last roughly 4 years is that you can't explain this inversion of demographics by any model that proposes that prescribing is the problem or the cause of addiction. It's not there. It has never been there. So what we are seeing is statistics of the CDC itself demonstrate that the logic behind the 2016 guidelines is bogus. It's flat not supported by the data that CDC itself has reported. But CDC has chosen to ignore the data and instead to enlist the opinions of people who were handpicked as anti-opioid advocates, who may even believe the nonsense that they talk, but they're lying through their teeth. And increasingly, they're being challenged in the literature and in popular media by people a little bit like me and different from me, some of them medical professionals, some of them patient advocates. And what we're saying to the CDC is, guys, you got it wrong. You got it desperately wrong. And you're doing it again with a revision that you have underway right now. Because the 5 people that you have rewriting the guidelines after they were challenged don't happen to have a board certification in pain medicine between them. None of them are experts in pain management. None of them are board certified in the field. They're basically public health hacks. They're people who don't have a right to have an opinion, much less to have it converted into national policy. Now, I realize I'm being a little strong here. This whole matrix of issues really bugs me because I talk to patients every week. I mean, literally every week, and it's more than one every week, who have been cut off from medications that were effective for them, that they never once misused, but they're being told by their doctors, I'm sorry, but I can't prescribe for you because my license may be at risk. And the number one, if you will, culprit in this is a DEA that has gone after the low-hanging fruit. DEA has not been successful in stopping the ingress of illegal opioids, at least not very successful. They do have published cases that come up now and then. But they know that doctors, especially those that are individual practice, can't really defend themselves. Because if a doctor's practice is challenged publicly, the practice goes dead. Because people are saying, oh, no, I can't possibly work with that doctor. He's not prescribing properly. He won't protect me properly. He's overprescribing. But the overprescribing part of this, the strategy is accuse them now, sort them out later, but get them out of practice no matter what lies you have to tell. And DEA knows this knows this just as well as you and I do. DEA is practicing extra-legal persecution of doctors, not appropriate enforcement of drug regulation. And this kind of nonsense needs to stop right freaking now.
So one argument one might hear is that these rules, these regulations have been put into place. They're helping more than they're hurting. I take it you totally disagree with that.
Absolutely.
I mean, so right now you mentioned the CDC is in theory reworking their recommendations, correct?
That's correct. There was a meeting July 16th of this year that outlined what they've done so far, and also that provided a report by an appointed oversight group. That's the group involved in this is the Opioid Work Group, and they report to the Board of Scientific Counselors of the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control.
Is there an opportunity with this process, or was there an opportunity for people like yourself or the general public to get involved?
Yes, that meeting provided not only the reports of progress so far, but also a 2-hour session for the public to register to comment in the meeting, in a meeting very much like the one you and I are having now, basically a Zoom session. The interesting little wrinkle here is that there were so many people who wanted to comment that they were restricted to 2 minutes each. And 2 minutes each has to be a pretty well prepared speech. Fortunately, now NCIPC also invited people to submit separate comments. I listened in on the comment session, and I would say that roughly something on the order of, let's say 50 to 60 people commented. 4 of them were advocates from PROP, and almost all of the rest said something to the effect of, "You're killing us, you idiots, because you're pursuing a fantasy instead of real science." And now, obviously, that's toned a little tough, but it was a real tough love session, believe me. The public deeply disagrees with the positions that the CDC is taking, at least the public that are chronic pain patients. That basically means about 20 million of them, maybe 20 to 40 million. That's the number of pain patients in this country. And 20 million of those who are pain patients, by the way, have unrelenting pain of a level that is sufficient to compromise the quality of their lives every day. And those are the people that were commenting in July 16th.
Now,
So,
when the CDC makes these recommendations, um, is that a done deal? You know, we've learned a lot about the CDC this past couple of years with the pandemic and how it works. Um, does that become law, whether they change or don't change anything? Do you know the process there?
interestingly enough, the CDC guidelines that were published in 2016 became effectively, at least some part of the guidelines became law in 36 states that chose them as a basis for specifying what appropriate practice was in the prescription of opioids. And not all states, but just about all state medical boards, which review the qualifications and practices of doctors to resolve complaints, took on the CDC limitations. And the limitations were in what is called morphine milligram equivalent daily dose, it's MMED. They took those on and basically said, if you go more than 90 MMED, you really should send this patient to a specialist in pain medicine. You know, if you're a general practitioner, you shouldn't be handling people at that dose. But various state legislators went further than that and basically said you shouldn't be prescribing more than 90 MMED ever to anybody. So CDC worked a really neat little handshake without ever actually putting all of these limitations into law. They used their influence to encourage state legislators who don't know from squat about this issue, except for what CDC says, to take the guidelines into their hands and turn them into law. Now, there's an interesting wrinkle in that regard, too. There was a letter published June of last year, June 2020, by the president of the American Medical Association. They don't have all doctors in their stable, but they have a substantial number of doctors. And in that letter to the person who headed up the CDC guideline writing group in 2016, what they said was, the idea that limiting opioid prescriptions is going to solve our opioid crisis is a myth. It's a mythology. It's not true. And moreover, you should be encouraging every state legislature to repeal any law that applies a hard limit on either opioid dose or duration. And that was AMA. 5 other nationally recognized professional organizations headed up by the American Academy of Family Practitioners, or maybe it's Family Physicians, I forget which, AAPF, and including, among others, the American Psychiatric Association, which writes the diagnostic and statistical manual for disease, by the way. They came online and basically said in, I think it was March or April of 2019, it is time to end political interference in evidence-based medicine and to remove law enforcement from doctors' offices. The aggregate group here represents over half of all practicing physicians and medical students in the US. When they take a public position of this type, it is not a trivial exercise. So both the AMA and the AAPF and several other medical associations have come on public record. And this was such a major kind of confrontation, it wasn't the only one, that in March of 2019, CDC was forced to make an announcement that basically amounted to, oops, we think our guidelines are being misused. Well, they never did get around to saying we think our guidelines are wrong, but what they said was a mea culpa intended not to solve the problem, but to get off the hook for being guilty of it. Because what they said to the public was, your state legislatures ought to do something about this because you shouldn't be using our guidelines as a hard and fast limit. And interestingly enough, the letter, the public letter that prompted that action was published I believe by the Journal of Pain Medicine. I'd have to go look it up to be sure, but it was published over the sponsorship of 300 practicing physicians who put their own professional reputations behind what they said. And what they said was, this is freaking madness. Freely translated, understand, that's word language that a doctor wouldn't typically use, because a doctor likes to be thought of as a professional. But there are some of them that are just as angry with this mess as I am.
So what can, a pain management doctor at this point, or a pain management patient, what can they do? Is it just beating down the door of your state legislature, or?
That's a big part of it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things I've been advising people to do, and I talk to a very large number of people every week, is you need to call your representative and your state and your senators, your federal senators, and your assembly person or your state senators and your governor's office and the state medical board. It's a long list when you think about it. What you need to say to these people is restrictions that you have encouraged on the practice of medicine are destroying pain medicine and killing thousands of people by suicide. Stop! Literally, with that kind of tone. I've had this conversation with my own representatives and the staffer that one talks to in these circumstances, because the representative or the senator never talks to you. But the staff are very polite. They're basically saying, I will record your input for the legislator, and you never hear from them again. But then you look carefully at what's actually going on in Congress, and they're not doing anything. They're not acting on the messages they're getting from tens of thousands of people. And I think it is that high by now. We've got a couple of other statistics that I think your viewers and readers, not readers really, your viewers and listeners may want to know, and I'll offer these to you. For one thing, there is an article out on the actually, there's an article on Washington Post in the last week or so, and a comment on that article in the American Council for Science and Health, in which we have legitimate medical investigators, people with appropriate qualifications, have looked at the statistics of overdose and death in veterans who are denied pain treatment, which, by the way, is VA policy right now. Veterans don't get opioids ever, no matter what their problem is. That's the result of a document that's called the Opioid Safety Initiative. And it has nothing to do with safety. And when you study that population and you see what's happened to veterans, after a veteran is tapered off of opioids involuntarily, the risk of overdose death quadruples. It is 4 times higher, and it is very likely caused by the act of involuntarily removing their pain treatment. We also know in a separate study of insurance records by non-veterans that in civilian populations where patients are tapered, either voluntarily or involuntarily, the risk of a mental health crisis or an overdose death is on the order of 2.5 to 3 times the risk of those events in the general population that are being maintained on opioids. There is now conclusive proof that denial of pain care kills people. And so far, the CDC has been vastly silent on that issue. It's time for that silence to end. That's been my message, and it will be the message of many others. We are, all of us, working to try to get Congress to sit up and take notice. The other thing that we basically have to realize is that doctors are gun shy for good reason. I mean, they're between a rock and a hard place. They're being told, if you do the slightest slip, if any one of your patients comes back and says, you gave me too much, or I didn't get a good result from your treatment, but I think I'm an addict now. If that happens, regardless of the merits, you're dead. Your practice is gone. Your livelihood is gone, and we will pursue you to the ends of the freaking earth to make that happen. Now, I might add, I'm quoting from a medical doctor who used very closely, very nearly those words, from a conference that he went to that was addressed by the chairman of their state medical board. The medical board basically said to these doctors, practicing doctors, an audience of over 100, if you are prescribing opioids, we're going to put you out of practice. And we don't care if you think it's unfair. Stop and cut them cold. And somebody in the audience was thinking, but not saying, because of course that makes him a target. You know, what about these patients? What do they do? And the fellow that was up there in front of this group basically said, you have to look for non-opioid pain treatments that are preferred, according to the CDC, over opioids. Well, now there's a wrinkle in that, and the doctor I talked to knew about this wrinkle. 2018 and 19, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, AHRQ, did a major outcome study on non-invasive, non-pharmaceutical treatments for pain. They surveyed over 5,000 studies and trials. And they filtered for quality, and they filtered for relevancy to the issues. And they got down to about 1,800 studies that they read line for line. And the quality of those studies was so poor that they could only select 218 of them to report. And out of those 218, not one of them was a head-to-head comparison of some kind of non-opioid treatment with some kind of opioid treatment. None of those trials were documented sufficiently even to find out what usual and customary treatment was. So the quality of the literature for non-opioid treatments of chronic pain is so poor that we don't know if they work any better than placebos. And yet the CDC labels them as preferred to opioids. Now, who did that little mess? So you can see that what we're dealing with is some very heavy hitters who are protected by government insurance against being sued. They can't be sued effectively. It's the doctrine of sovereign immunity. Even though they're wrong, and even though they know they're wrong, and even though everybody else knows they're wrong, they won't give an inch, because if they do so, their personal reputations might be harmed. Now, that's not a quote. That's a judgment on what's really going on here. In my view, and I've said this publicly in an article I published not long ago, the entire writers group for the revision that's underway should be fired for cause and denied ever being able to practice any form of medicine to any patient cohort. They're that bad. They are public health hacks, and they are destroying lives in large numbers.
You mentioned at the beginning about your personal your personal interaction with pain and how it affected you and your family. What else? You say you talk with people all the time. What, personalize this for me. What are these people experiencing, and what is this doing to the quality of life that is supposed to be helped by modern medicine?
Okay, well, there are dimensions to this. There's more than one kind of patient outcome. I have about 5,000 followers on Facebook, and my stuff appears on platforms that typically generate something like 200,000 impressions every day. So I hear from a lot of people, and they know where to find me. So believe me, my inbox is full. What I typically get from people is, my doctor retired, and he retired without giving me referral to anybody else, and nobody else within 100 miles of me will take me. And the one practice that I did talk to, this is perhaps a different different patient. The one practice I did talk to said, well, we're not taking new patients, and the patients we have are being tapered to less than 90 mmED without exception. And this was from a patient whose former doctor was treating her with 350 mmED every day. What she told me was, I can't get out of bed. I am typing on my laptop right now because if I get out of bed, my legs will hurt so much that I collapse. Now, here's another narrative. My mother just died in hospice, and she was in hospice for 6 months, and the only pain reliever they would give her was Tylenol. She was in agony the entire time, screaming for help, and they would not help her. They closed the door on her room and left her alone. Now, that is an almost word-for-word narrative from one of the people that contacted me. Patients are being deserted broadly. The doctors who are still practicing, and it's probably less than 40% of the doctors who were 6 years ago, the doctors who are still practicing are extensively documenting they're having to go through all kinds of hoops with pre-approvals from insurance companies. Some pharmacists are refusing to act on pre-approvals and denying prescriptions that are legitimate to pain patients. Some pharmacists go so far as to blacklist doctors with all of the pharmacies in the area so that they can't get anybody to fulfill their opioid prescriptions. That's also from a doctor. And Amy Chagnon can also tell you a little bit about that when you go talk to her. Patients are now with their doctors between a rock and a hard place, and we are on the hairy edge of a wave of patient suicides. There are already over hundreds that have just been documented. There's a very interesting legal case, as a matter of fact, in Kentucky. The family of a patient who committed suicide successfully sued the practice that denied him pain care for $7 million. If that settlement holds up under appeal, it's going to put a whole bunch of pain practices on notice that you can't tell these people they don't hurt. Because if you do and you refuse treatment, you are legally liable for abandoning them. That, I think, may have some serious impact out there. What we really need probably is a class action suit against CDC. It will be a real bear to mount that. But there is a case that's being pursued by the Chapman Law Firm. I believe they're from Michigan and DC, where there is a writ before the U.S. Supreme Court requesting that the Supreme Court direct I think it's Walgreens pharmacies to develop and publish a standard, a uniform standard for what comprises usual and accepted medical practice in the prescription of opioids, because there is no such document now. There is no universal standard for what real normal practice is. And even the guidelines that are published by the National Association of State Medical Boards don't declare an MMED threshold. And that's one of the good things about them. There's a lot of stuff in there that ain't so good. But so what we've got is that so-called expert witnesses are voting their opinions about what normal practice is. And their opinions aren't worth squat. Some of them aren't even pain management specialists. They're not backed by any science. They're not backed by any data. And worse yet, oh, by the way, the FDA had a workshop in early June of this year to examine the science behind the whole notion of morphine milligram equivalents, which would relate the dose of one opioid to the dose of another. And what they found out is there is no science. The entire field and the entire specification of 50 and 90 are what a scientist calls a data artifact. CDC looked at data that was organized in patients who had been given 20 MMED or less, 20 to 50, 50 to 90, and over 90. Well, it turns out those are simply reporting levels that are part of the case notes that hospitals generate when they admit somebody for opioid toxicity. If they have medical prescriptions, they're characterized in those terms. But there is no curve that shows that the probability of opioid toxicity goes up in any significant way other than a kind of a gradual weak slope. There's no knee in the slope that says, up to here you're okay, at such and such a level, but when you go up to there, there's a much higher risk. There's no such curve. There's no data to support such curve. So MMED is what an old guy like me, who is a little bit intolerant, calls junk science. It's not science at all. It's an effort to help doctors to figure out if they switch between one opioid and another, how much of the next opioid that they're going to use should they use? What's the equivalence? And it turns out that it's a very, very weak measure. And there is at least a 15 to 1 range in minimum effective dose between individuals on the same medications. And that 15 to 1 range is established by a very extensive literature that's called, genetic effects of opioids metabolism. That's the breakdown of opioids in the body system, in the liver. So what we have here is that the US CDC has been using junk science as the fundamental logic for a guideline, quote, guideline, actual standard, that impacts the lives of 40 million people in this country. Because 40 million of us every year will be treated either short-term or long-term on an opioid analgesic, an opioid pain reliever. Of that 40 million, 20 million are in intractable pain that affects the quality of their lives every day. And about 3.5 million of them are taking opioids for a period of longer than 60 days.
Do you see the recent change in state laws regulating certain Schedule 1 drugs, or drugs that were Schedule 1, marijuana, the layman's terms, mushrooms or shrooms? Is that playing into, is that helping in this case?
What we're seeing
is the research on that?
The research still hasn't caught up. There are some indications that in states where medical marijuana is dispensed from regulated dispensaries that have state oversight, the rates of opioid prescribing are at least marginally dropping, but we don't know if that's cause and effect. Basically, the rates of prescribing are dropping all over the US. They're being forced down by the regulatory environment, and whether prescribing of medical marijuana is a positive force in that, we just don't know. And as long as medical marijuana remains federally scheduled, we're not going to find out. My proposal is that it should be taken completely out of the federal schedule and left to doctors to decide. Other marijuana-related products, notably CBD oil and THC, which is an active ingredient in marijuana, seem to help some patients some of the time. And there are reports in social media of people who have had a significant pain reduction, but there's been no systematic effort to actually go in and trial this issue to get closure on just what exactly the science can support.
So are you, bigger picture now, are you hopeful that there's an end to what you see as this issue? We've got a huge, as you well know, a baby boomer population. It's looking to have a good quality of life. This issue on that end is not going away. Do you see it?
It isn't going away, but as far as short-term relief is concerned, what we saw on July 16th was an outline of recommendations, if you will, without a lot of supporting data, but an outline of recommendations by the CDC Writers Group that basically doubled down on the same nonsense they committed in 2016. In some cases, they use words very strongly similar, and those words were challenged directly by the appointed opioid work group that was charged with identifying issues. The report of the opioid work group is available on the CDC website. It's worth reading. The minutes of the 2016 meeting, including the documents that are being submitted by people other than those who spoke, should be available by October. And by the end of the year, we should see a revised guideline put out for public review on the Federal Register. My reading of the environment now is that when that guideline comes out, if it continues to commit the idiocy that we saw on July 16th, there are going to be people who march on Washington and on state capitals to say, guys, you not only got it wrong, you got it criminally wrong because you failed to account for science that is well established and you are negligently killing people. And that's a voice I think we're going to hear more of. Whether this will resolve before the new guideline is issued in the spring of next year, I cannot yet read. I do know there is a building sense of serious urgency in patient and doctor communities. Doctors are tired of being persecuted too, and they want relief. And the AMA has given them a factual basis for challenging, practically speaking, any action against them. I think a lot of doctors haven't realized that yet. They need to go read the AMA letter published in June of last year. But your question you ask is, do you see relief on the horizon? The answer I would give you is, I see the possibility of relief, and I see it happening over the objections and the falsifications and the fraud that's been published by the CDC. And if CDC doesn't wake up and smell the coffee, they're going to lose all credibility with people who need a credible source of other information in areas where they actually have a little expertise. And they need to start realizing they're in deep doo-doo, because so far they haven't.
Now, in a email that you had sent me before we talked here, or you'd sent George, you mentioned this Stanford pain management study that, at least according to this, was still recruiting. Is that still happening, and if so,
the recruiting is still underway.
Okay, tell us a little bit about it.
The study is headed by Sean Mackey. He is the director of the Department of Pain Management at Stanford. It has, what is the name? I have to think of the lady's name. There's another doctor who's quite prominent and quite well known who is going to be processing a lot of the data. And what they're going to try to do is that they are going to look at
Dr. Beth Darnell.
Yeah, Beth Darnell, that's right. And I've heard her speak, and she's a pretty sharp cookie. What they're going to do is they're going to try to taper patients and monitor their outcomes in 3 surveys during a period of a year. They will taper some patients and they will not taper others, and they will compare results, compare outcomes on a whole series of questions that have to do with the patient's experience of pain control and quality of life. And I already know part of what's likely to happen. They're probably going to have a horrendous dropout rate among people who are actually tapered, because we've seen that in other published work. But they are going to make the attempt to actually go in and carefully document what the patient's experience is. I'd have to look up the name of that study right now. It's not in my head, but I have basically told the people that I influence that if they can take that time to do the surveys, I think that the study is worth doing, and I think that it's worth having them participate in.
Well, we'll definitely link to it, and we'll get that information out there, along with the information on the two doctors or the doctors involved in this. Do you have anything else that you'd like to say? I know we've talked for quite a while.
Well, I know we have.
That's okay.
Boy, howdy! Time flies whether or not you're having fun.
Yeah.
Let me see if there's anything I have here that I would add as a footnote. I guess I would say there's one more thing I would offer.
Mm-hmm.
And in this, I want to be very clear that I am to some degree self-interested. I've been working with a statistician and a very competent doctor who is in the Veterans Administration system. His name is Steve Nadeau. And the three of us recently had a paper published by Frontiers in Pain Medicine. The title of that paper is Opioids and Chronic Pain, an analytic review of the clinical evidence. What Steve and I have done is we've gone in and we've tracked what the medical literature has to say about a number of medical issues that are surrounding the use of opioids in treating pain, and particularly treating long-lasting chronic pain. This document was published August 17th. In the month since that period, or since that publication, it has had more than 7,000 downloads from this source, which exceeds the activity in 85% of all papers published on this venue. An earlier version of this document was published, or this paper I should say, was published by the Journal of Medicine of the U.S. College of Physicians. Now, this is a lesser journal, but they got 11,900 downloads since March. And I think this paper should be required reading for anyone who prescribes or regulates in the practice of pain medicine, because it basically, in a thoughtful and referenced way, and by referenced, I mean 128 references in 6,000 words. This is not trivial reading. This document knocks a hole in the CDC guidelines big enough to drive a 6-deuce truck through, because it reveals that the guidelines are not only wrong, they are desperately wrong on every piece of science in them, which was kind of an incidental finding. Now that's Red with his hair on fire talking. It's not phrased that way. For a medical professional, this document, this paper, takes you all the way through the background of this issue and its various dimensions, and does it with the published literature of others. So this is not opinion. This is solidly grounded information. And I think this could be a paper that will wind up being one of the most widely cited in the literature of pain medicine. At least I hope it will be, because we're seeing the initial indicators now.
Good. So, Richard, Red, where can people get a hold? How can people get a hold of you if they need to, or share?
If they want to get a hold of me, and I grit my teeth as I say this, you can send me email at Lawhern, that's Lawhern, at hotmail.com. I get an awful lot of mail through there already. I have a horrible suspicion it's going to get to be a lot more after you guys get on the air. But that's one way to do it. If you want to join the social media that I am active in, you can basically read in facebook.com/red.lawhern. Let's see if that's for sure, if that's the right URL. Yeah, right.
I think so.
It's www.facebook.com/redlawhern. And my page is public, even if there are already so many people subscribed to it that you may not become one of my friends. I generally allow the public access. You got to be one of my friends before you can actually respond to my postings there. That's just to protect myself from being overwhelmed. As it is, I get mail every doggone day, and I get comments through my Facebook page every day. I'm also active on a medium called Quora, QUORA.com. I'm active in Twitter as Lawhern1. That's ampersand Lawhern1 with a capital L. I'm active on LinkedIn, and I have over 40 papers published on LinkedIn. So you do a Google search on my name, and you're going to get probably over 5,000 hits. It's not hard to find me.
All right. Well, thank you again for taking the time. Taking about an hour of your time, which is great. And we'll definitely get this out there to the public.